Alright, what's happening, everybody? Welcome back. Still talking about World War I today. What we're going to cover today is a little strange. It's not your typical wartime conversation. We're not talking about, X's and O's and looking at battle plans and talking about who won this battle or which side won this or lost this. Today, our focus is going to be less on the war itself and more on this word sedition. And what sedition means, we'll get to in just a second, but basically, we're going to talk about how this war affects people at home, particularly Americans at home, once we finally get involved in World War I. So, okay, here we go. Let's look at this word sedition for a second. You might have heard it before. You probably did if you took government in high school. But this term sedition is kind of a weird one to wrap your head around. Sedition is basically any sort of action that you can take as a citizen to basically rebel against the government. Now, this definition that you have here in front of you is like a really fancy pants long one. It says inciting discontent or rebellion against the government. If you are committing sedition against the government, you are basically saying, I don't trust my government. I'm not going to follow the rules of my government. I'm going to do whatever I want. On a completely other note, sedition is something that has been contested over time in America as not being 100% protected in terms of free speech. We Americans love to throw around the idea of free speech and being able to say what we want to say at any time. There have been a handful of Supreme Court cases in the United States throughout its history that sort of test this idea of sedition based on, what we're allowed to say in terms of the country. But I want you to think to yourself for a second, why do you think somebody during World War I, in terms of an American citizen, why might you think somebody would be displeased or unhappy or not really in total agreement with the United States? Think about that for a second, and we'll get back to that in a second. Here is, if you want to kind of go a little bit further, there's a short Discovery education video talking about sedition and basically why during World War I sedition was an issue. But I'm not going to go through that here, obviously. If you want to get a bit better understanding of that, there's the link for you there. I know some of you guys were having a hard time getting into Discovery Ed last week for the video that I posted about yellow journalism, talking about the Spanish-American War and everything. So if you're having a hard time with it, don't worry about it. But if you want it, it's there. I'm wondering how many of you guys have ever heard of this Selective Service Act. It's something that actually still exists today. The Selective Service Act, when you turn 18 in the United States at this point, you basically are automatically, maybe inducted is the wrong word, but admitted rather. Your name, your information is placed into a database for use by the United States. But where it starts, and this is going to sort of lead us into why sedition is important and what it even means in the United States, is right as World War I is beginning, we have a need for, you guessed it, soldiers, right? So in order to get us involved, in order to get enough young men to go out and actually fight in the war, we need enough people to go fight in World War I. So, well, there's a couple ways you could do that. You could basically ask everybody, hey, do you want to go fight in the war? And a lot of people might say no, especially people who might not necessarily agree that this war is worth fighting. Because remember, guys, Woodrow Wilson, who's president at the time, he sort of runs this re-election campaign on this entire idea of, hey, everybody, I'm going to keep the United States out of World War I. It's not a United States problem. It's a Europe problem. Don't worry about it. I'll keep you out of war. Well, come 1917, when it comes time for us to actually get involved in war, there is sort of a need to produce troops. And with that came the Selective Service Act. And again, we still have the Selective Service Act today, but all we need to know about it during World War I is it's the law that creates the military draft. So Woodrow Wilson basically says that if you are drafted, if your number comes up, you are required by law, unless something else sort of prohibits you from going, if you're not physically capable of fighting. This is a requirement by law for you to go partake in the war. Now think for a second, why, if you are a young man, why do you think this might be sort of a controversial issue? Think back to what I just said a minute ago. Woodrow Wilson just ran, a couple years ago, an entire re-election campaign for president on the idea that he was going to keep us out of World War I. Now look at this flyer here. And look down here. It says, no excuse for failure to register will be accepted. Now, Woodrow Wilson has completely changed his mind. He's saying that by law, if you get drafted, you gotta go. So think for a second why this might be controversial or unpopular. Okay? And what we end up seeing is just a complete storm of young men going out and signing up to go fight and serve their country. And guys, don't get it confused. I don't want you to think that no Americans were ready to go fight in World War I. That is not the case at all. As you can see here, there's a whole long line of young men who think that it's going to be their chance to go serve their country and do something special. But remember who the United States is going to be fighting against. Remember the reason why the United States gets involved in World War I. This combination of several things that ultimately starts with United States passengers on ships getting killed by German submarines. Remember the Zimmerman telegram that's sent from Germany to Mexico to sort of entice them to come and try and enter the war on the side of Germany and sort of wage war against the United States. So at this point, the U.S. feels like it's our duty to get involved. We have this responsibility. That's, of course, Woodrow Wilson's big style of diplomacy, right? As he waits for something to happen, and then on moral grounds, he feels like, okay, this is why we need to get involved here. Now, think back to the question I asked you a second ago about why this might be controversial, why it might be an unpopular decision to force young men to go fight in this war, even if they don't want to. Think about the makeup of the United States at this time. We're still a really young country. In the weeks and months prior to this, in class, we've talked about so many different immigrant groups that have come to the United States. They're still in the United States. It's not like there has been generations and generations of, acclimating behavior where everybody feels 100% American at this point. There are still people who really have close ties to their homeland. And in the case of Germans in the United States, there's a really, really, really large number of German Americans in the United States. Check that number out, guys. 17 million out of 100 million Americans had been born outside of the United States. That means that almost 1 in 5, okay, just under 20%, but almost 1 in 5 of every single American at that time had not even been born in the United States. They had been born in a homeland and then come to the United States, however they immigrated here. Now, German Americans have been here for quite a long time, as it says here, since, colonial America. However, by World War I, a lot of the German Americans that we have are American-born, meaning that they were born inside the borders of the United States. But by 1910, we still have almost 10% of the American population being born in Germany, or had, maybe one generation removed from German descent, meaning maybe they weren't born in Germany, but their parents were born in Germany. So you can imagine that for some of these people, it must have been really, really tough for them to think, okay, who do I fight for? Do I fight for the United States? Because now, allegedly, I'm an American, or do I fight for Germany? And if you're having a hard time thinking about that, think of it this way. If you've ever moved, if you've ever switched schools, let's say that you went to Westminster High School for 3 out of the 4 years. Okay, let's say that you did freshman and sophomore and junior year at Westminster High School. But then, in your senior year, you move, right? You go to maybe a different school in the county, or maybe you even move out of the state of Maryland and you go to another school. Imagine that if years and years and years from now, people asked you, where'd you go to high school? Or, you know, which team did you play for when you were in school? You would have a hard time because you spent a lot of your time in high school. You spent a lot of it at Westminster. Maybe you go for your senior year to another school, you graduate from that school, you get a diploma from that school, but you don't really feel tied to it, right? I mean, you might have a piece of paper that says that you belong there, but you spent a lot of your time at Westminster. Think about that. Apply that to all of the German Americans in the United States at the time. You know, there are people who have spent literally their entire lives in Germany or in another country, and then all of a sudden come to the United States, and now they're expected to be, you know, air quotes, they're expected to be American and to have complete allegiance to the United States. Now here's where it gets a little shady, a little interesting. At this time, we have what's called the American Protective League, otherwise known as the APL, and this is a network of volunteers of about 250,000 people, civilians, you know, regular people, not police officers or, you know, private detectives or anything. These are people who, they had one job. They were basically hired by the government to go out and be, I don't want to use the word spies, but spies is probably the closest term that would make sense. So we basically hire about 250,000 regular American people to go act like spies on anybody who is suspected that might not be entirely loyal to the United States. Now you're thinking, what does that look like? You know, how do you hire civilians? How do you hire regular people to come out and act like spies? Think about this for a second. If you are a German American, okay, and maybe you own a store, maybe you own a shoe store, or maybe you own a restaurant, or maybe you own a pharmacy, or a supermarket, or whatever. You know, you're a business person, you sell something. You would have one of these people, one of these 250,000 civilians, regular people. And by the way, they don't wear uniforms. They don't wear like the American Protective League, you know, jumpsuit. They look like regular people. So imagine that you're a German American and you're just running your store. Let's say that you own, you know, a deli. Somebody would come into the store and they would act like a regular customer. They would, you know, probably buy something. They would probably try and strike up conversation with you. And they wouldn't come up straight up and ask you, "Hi, are you a loyal American? Do you completely trust President Woodrow Wilson and believe what we're doing is right in World War I?" They would definitely not ask that. That's like, you know, Spy 101. You don't tell people exactly what your plans are. But what they would do is they would start striking up conversation with you, and they would probably say something to the effect of, "Gee, you know, this war is pretty crazy, huh? What do you think about it? I mean, can you believe we're going to war with Germany?" And basically, if you had, the German, if you're the store owner here, if you had anything to say other than something completely loyal to the United States, like, "Yep, I completely agree with what we're doing, and yet what we're doing is definitely the right thing." If you said anything other than that, you were basically deemed somebody who was disloyal to the United States. If you look down at this paragraph here, there's really not any room for diverging viewpoints, meaning that even if you kept silent, even if somebody asked you, "Do you agree with what we're doing? Are you loyal to the United States?" Basically, according to the APL, if you said anything other than, "Yes, I 100% support what we're doing in World War I," they viewed that as you were not loyal. If you're not buying war bonds to try and support the troops, if you're not going out and, you know, being as patriotic as you can and enthusiastic, that's an issue. And they see that as, this person's not loyal. We need, and by we, I mean the American government, we need to keep an eye on them because this isn't working. So keep in mind, guys, that this is going to be one of the toughest times for civil liberties during World War I, during American history in general. It's not a time where a whole lot of freedom is celebrated. It's a time where the civil liberties and the rights of people are really being tested. All right, so go ahead and switch over to part 2 for me, and I'll catch you up in the second half of this video.